Good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, and very pleased to be also the Vice Chairman of the group we're here to launch, the Committee on the Present Danger, China. And my purpose is simply to try to make the trains run on time here. You'll have an opportunity to hear from an impressive cross-section of this very distinguished group of national security professionals, China experts, human rights activists, business leaders, religious freedom champions, and more. And our hope today is to express from the perspective of such experts a sense of the magnitude of the present danger this country and, frankly, the free world and even the not-so-free world face from the Chinese Communist Party and the country that it misrules ever more aggressively. Aggressively both with respect to the people of China and with respect to its neighbors and increasingly the rest of the world. I'm hoping that when we're through today's program, we will have really helped to set the stage for a serious national debate about China, about the threat that it currently poses, its evident aspirations, and what we in the United States and the rest of the free world especially need to be doing to try to address and mitigate the danger that is very real and growing. So I'm going to mostly stay out of the way, but I did want to just say thank you all for coming. I'm deeply appreciative that so many of our colleagues, some of whom are going to be speaking, some of whom are simply going to be part of our audience, are here. The support, the enthusiasm, the commitment to this effort, our hope that it will have the kind of impact that previous iterations of this brand, the Committee on the Present Danger, have had, will be, I think, evident in the course of my colleagues' remarks. So with that, let me introduce the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, Brian Kennedy. Many of you may know him from his distinguished and long leadership of a marvelous organization based on the West Coast, the Claremont Institute. These days he is the president of American Strategy Group. Thank you. Close enough for government work. Brian Kennedy, welcome.
Frank gave me the high sign of 4 minutes, so Frank is serious about these things. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you also to Frank Gaffney for your leadership on this most important topic. Your energy, intellect, and commitment to the cause of our national defense is unparalleled. Thank you, Frank. The Committee on the Present Danger, China, is a wholly independent and nonpartisan effort to educate and inform American citizens and policymakers about the existential threat presented from the People's Republic of China under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Its purpose is to explain these threats that range from the military buildup of the PRC, their active information and political warfare that targets the American people and our business, political, and media elites, their cyber warfare, and their economic warfare. The committee takes no ideological point of view. Rather, it relies on the facts as reasonable people can understand them. Armed with these facts, the committee believes the common sense of the American people will demand from their elected officials that all reasonable measures be taken to defend these United States, our economic interests, and the security of the American people. We engage in this at a time unique in American history. The country has not been so divided politically since the Civil War. and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have left the nation with little desire to look abroad for new threats. The media and half of our political system has spent the last 2 years preoccupied with Russian collusion, a charge that now is disproven and whose origins appear malicious. The Russian charges of political meddling are especially ridiculous when one considers the array of threats posed by the People's Republic of China. Back when the 1970s era iteration of the Committee on the Present Danger existed, the Soviet Union had very few economic ties with the United States. In the case of the PRC, these ties are extensive. These economic ties have created a well-funded lobby made of Wall Street and their interests and Communist China that is quite motivated to make sure that things stay as they have been. This relationship has benefited the People's Republic of China. To them, we have transferred trillions of dollars of wealth through trade. As you'll hear, they have stolen and extracted some of our most important technology, and because of this relationship, they've become a first world military and economic power. This seems to be poorly understood, especially here in Washington. But I, for one, am encouraged that the threat is understood by President Trump. In his books and many speeches, he has been a consistent critic of China's grand strategic design. President Trump wrote 20 years ago, when he was but businessman Trump, he said, "We have to make it absolutely clear that we're willing to trade with China, but not to trade away our principles, and that under no circumstances will we keep our markets open to countries that steal from us. If that means losing some big contracts to the French or the Germans or whomever, so be it. American foreign policy needs to open the doors for American trade and not the other way around. Principles and national self-interest here speak with the same voice. There are some things," the president said, "that are more important than profits, and one of them is our own national security." End of quote. President Trump questioned early on whether the United States could genuinely benefit from such a relationship. He said of China, "It fears freedom because it knows its survival depends on oppression. It does not respect individuals' rights. It is still at heart a collectivist society. As such, it is a destabilizing force in the world and should be viewed that way." President Trump wrote this before most in this country could see the Chinese for who they truly were. Our hope with this committee is to explain how China really is today, what they're doing in the world, and how they understand themselves. We believe that in discussing China, the facts will speak for themselves. I can say, on my part, I look forward to working with the rest of the committee and the media to explain to our countrymen the true state of affairs. Thank you.
Next, it's a great privilege to say we have an individual who actually was involved in, indeed led, the Committee on the Present Danger during arguably its most impactful period, namely during the 1970s. And he is a former Defense Department official, a naval aviator, and a distinguished man in every sense of the word to help make the connection between the legacy of the Committee on the Present Danger of the past and this most important new venture. Chuck Nagel, where are you?
Thank you, Frank. Undeserved praise. No. Good afternoon. For those here whom I've not met and have not made not made a friend, my name is Chet Nagel. I'm privileged to be here to assist with the rebirth of a time-honored organization, the Committee on the Present Danger. It was a committee basically founded in the 50s to illuminate and confront the threat that the Soviet Union posed to the United States. Through the hard work of its leaders and its membership, it became a formidable and effective force in the battle against communist Russia. Now, despite my advanced years, I was not involved in that very early history of the committee. I did not get involved until some decades later, primarily through Peter Hannaford, who many of you probably know, who was a great Reaganaut and a chronicler of the president's life. But as a naval aviator, I was well aware of the Soviet threat to the United States. Every time my carrier intercepted a Russian submarine in the North Atlantic, and when my battle group was the first to arrive in Cuban waters during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sponsored by Communist Russia. But finally, the Cold War ended, and to paraphrase President Reagan, we won, they lost. The threat seemed to be gone, and the Committee on the Present Danger began to become dormant. I had resigned my commission and moved on to a new career overseas and spent some years in a very exciting life abroad. I then returned to Washington, and some 15 or more years ago, Peter contacted me again and said that he was planning to stand up a new committee on the present danger that would address the threat of terrorism to the United States. He was very prescient in that regard. I agreed to be part of his effort, and we went to work. Unfortunately, Peter died in 2004, and with his guiding light extinguished, and with age taking its toll on the membership, my main task was to have an orderly wind-up of the committee's affairs. But now, as you've heard, another existential threat to America has arisen, and it's demanding the call again, to call forth the Committee on the Present Danger. That threat is Communist China's plan to dominate the United States and ultimately the entire world by what they have published and they call unrestricted warfare. We are now at warfare with the People's Republic of China, and it will stay that way for decades. Today, through the efforts of new and vigorous leadership, Brian Kennedy and Frank Gaffney, and all the founding members here and in other cities, the committee is being reborn as the Committee on the Present Danger, China. I know I speak for all founding members when I invite every American citizen, those in both political parties, industrialists, journalists, educators, students, and members of patriotic organizations to join with the Committee on the Present Danger, China, as it begins its work to confront and defeat Communist China's growing existential threat to the United States and the free world. Thank you.
Next, we have an opportunity to take stock of the big picture of what the Chinese are up to with one of the great thinkers about these subjects and essayists and authors of our time, Mark Helprin. Please welcome him here. Thank you, Mark.
Let's just get right to it because of the time limitation. The United States has neither a legitimate interest in stopping the rise of China, nor can we do so. However, we do have a crucial interest in preventing the hegemony to which China has always felt entitled, so as to keep the world free from China's style of governance, which, if unopposed, it will force or encourage, as Britain once did, and as we have done, but in our case, according to Republican rather than totalitarian principles. Among other things, a world subject to China's hegemony will suffer continual warfare as nations and peoples attempt to escape the smothering restrictions, the model of which we have seen in Mao's China and see now in a nightmarish technological iteration. To block Chinese hegemony and avoid open warfare, we have only one course of action, which is carefully to develop and concentrate upon our own strengths, so as to deter China militarily and rise to its economic and geostrategic challenges throughout the world. This requires operating in three major domains: defense, the economy, and the repair of our own faltering civilization. Though these are of equal importance, they must be considered in light of time. Our politics and culture are in decline, but we may have sufficient residual capital so as to bumble on for decades. Our often limping economy has great natural strength and, if liberated, will long retain its formidable potential. But defense is subject to bolts from the blue, and the military domain is what provides protection, space, and time in which the other domains can be put in order. Therefore, it must be put in order first. No deal will ever correct our own deficiencies. And the one paramount deal to be sought, bringing China into a nuclear arms control regime, we mysteriously do not seek. China can accomplish its first war aims to clear the Western Pacific of American power by eliminating our vulnerable bases there, none of which has sufficiently hardened aircraft and store shelters, air and missile defenses sufficient to defeat saturation attacks, protection against special forces, or capacity for repair. Without these bases, we will be defeated. Though our air and sea lift are inadequate to a European war, the distance across the Pacific is twice that across the Atlantic. By spiking the Panama Canal, which we abandoned and China took on, and blocking the southern capes with nuclear attack submarines, China would have to fight only 60% of our fleets. All this without striking the U.S. homeland, while bases in China are sheltered for fear of nuclear escalation. Just as we have not hardened our Western Pacific bases, we have catastrophically truncated the development of long-range air power. The Navy, half the size of the Reagan Navy, states now that to shift resources to weapon systems, it will further curtail its unprepossessing shipbuilding program. This would be the best policy only if the nation had to choose between platforms and payloads. Which brings me to my last and most important point. It does not. The military dutifully bends to this stricture, but politicians and the people need not. It is foolish, cowardly, and in the long term not survivable to accept that provisioning our defense is secondary to assuring our comfort. History teaches emphatically that if we are not faithful to the former, the latter will vanish entirely. In the peacetime years, between 1940 and 2000, defense expenditure averaged 5.7% of GDP. And today, just as in the feckless Obama administration, it is 3%, $3 per hundred. One does not have to be Winston Churchill to see the heartbreak and tragedy to which this will lead. We sleep as a nation because we betray our ancient character. Of all things, this need not be so. And I did it for you.
Thank you, everybody, for this amazing display of discipline as well as articulate commentary. Next up, a man I think all of us know from his distinguished service to the United States, well, in a number of different capacities, but particularly memorable was his time as the Director of Central Intelligence under the Clinton administration. Jim Woolsey has volunteered to talk about a particular problem that I think is sort of emblematic of what we are now confronting from China in terms of its business operations and technology activities. Jim Woolsey, please join us to talk about 5G.
Thanks, Frank. I wish we had only one major undertaking to deal with that we face from China. I'm afraid we have at least three. And at least two of the three meet Sun Tzu's optimal description of warfare in which you win without having to fight. Now, one that we might lose, and the previous speaker did an excellent job of laying this out, so I won't repeat it. One that we might lose by fighting if we are insufficiently prepared and insufficiently trained and insufficient amount of reserve capability and all the rest. That is a serious problem. And we need to deal with it and make sure that we could win. Now, this next time around, if it should occur, it won't be as straightforward and as quick as, say, the Gulf War was in 1990. We will have certain disadvantages, and they've been outlined here, and we need to deal with those. But there are two others that we need to pay attention to, and those are both extremely serious. One is that it is not necessary for a country to attack using a nuclear weapon by launching and targeting and re-entering and hitting a particular target with a nuclear weapon or any other kind of weapon. It is perfectly easy, and indeed the Russians did this in 1957, to launch a satellite. And if you put it in a polar orbit that crosses a single place in the United States, let's say Omaha, a couple of times a day, and it has a nuclear weapon in it, even a very simple Hiroshima-style nuclear weapon, nothing with enhanced capabilities of any kind. And that is detonated tens to hundreds of miles above the surface of the Earth. The long and short wavelengths of emanations that can come from that can both destroy our electric grid and each of our electronic devices that we all live with. It does not need to be accurate. It does not need range. It does not need any of the things that the press and many experts say it needs. It needs only to get into orbit, a problem Russia solved in 1957. So, there is electromagnetic pulse, and Peter Pride has forgotten more about this than I know, and many of us in the room would know, and I'm sure he'll talk about it later. Second area that we have to deal with, that we are almost completely unprepared to deal with, is 5G. We have to be able to turn away Chinese domination of our internet and our overall capabilities, our servers and everything else. Through Huawei and through other paths, they are embarked very heavily on that effort. That is a loser for us in every way one can possibly lose. And let me give you an example. It is as if it were, say, 1910, and families were just starting to get automobiles. The Model T had gone into production, and it's a new idea. Every family could have a car instead of a horse and buggy. What an amazing thing. But all we had by way of roads was mud tracks across fields, because that's all you really need with horses. Then, all of a sudden, a Chinese guy shows up in Washington and holds a press conference. And he said, I want to welcome America here to the 20th century and tell you something. We are delighted that you are going to be involved in trying to use automobiles. You need roads for that. You need city streets, you need major roads, you need freeways. We're building those now in China. We know how to do it. We have patents on all ways to do it, and we have dominance of all the technology of ways to do it. And we want to welcome you to contracting with us so that we may put down an infrastructure for you. We'll let you know within the next month or two what your tolls will be every time you get on a road that we have built, what your costs will be. They'll be rather substantial. See you in a month. Thank you very much. Welcome to the 20th century. That is facing us. And every purchase of Huawei materials, everything that is being done by people who have blinders on with respect to what the Chinese are going to be able to do if we don't stop them. Everyone who has blinders on better take them off. Thank you.
Let me introduce one of our colleagues who knows firsthand the character and horrors of the Chinese Communist Party. He's Lao Chan Han. He is a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute these days, but he's one of the founders and vice presidents of the Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars. Lao Chan, welcome.
Good afternoon. Evidence shows that Chinese communist regime has become the biggest threat to the United States and the free world. This threat is real and very, very serious. But many people have not realized the magnitude and the scope and the seriousness of this threat. The engagement and the appeasement advocates continue to push for their failed China policy. So it is our duty to inform and educate the American public and decision makers what the CCP really is, what they intend to do, and why they're so dangerous. Despite the deceptive cover, the CCP is nothing but the biggest evil cult, the biggest organized crime group in the world. During its 70 years anniversary, 70 years rule over China, it has killed all tens of millions of people. When Xi Jinping came to power, he became more repressive in ways different than from his predecessors since the Cultural Revolution. He has been cracking down on any dissent and closing up the society. The horrible Weger internment camp is an example. He's also weaponized the surveillance by using the technology it's stolen from this country to build a massive surveillance system, which consists of Skynet and smart city and sharp eyes to spy on every citizen, to eliminating any chance of uprising against this state, party state. What's more, the CCP has been pushing its repressive and totalitarian party state model globally. Its political economic influence has expanded rapidly and reached every corner of the world. In the developing countries, in EU, in the United States, undermining democracy and the free world as we know it. But why does CCP do this at home and abroad? Despite the new terms it uses often, such as modernization, China dream, national rejuvenation, shared destination of mankind, the CCP's strategic goal has never changed, which has always been to defeat the United States in both wartime and peacetime, to gain the world dominance and replace capitalism with so-called socialism of Chinese characteristics, and replace Western civilization with Chinese communist civilization. To achieve this, the CCP has a very comprehensive and coherent grand strategy to direct, to guide its action. And they even have a timetable to get it done, which is 2049, the 100 years anniversary of People's Republic of China. If we don't take the Communist China threat seriously, the U.S. will be outmaneuvered, outmatched across all contested areas. In this life and death war between good and evil, freedom and repression, democracy and dictatorship, we really have no choice but to fight to win the day. Thank you.
Next, I want to turn to another demonstration of the enormity of China's commitment to activities that I think, if properly understood, can only be seen as hostile. A man who I've had the privilege of knowing through several incarnations of his service in the government. These days he is the president of the Potomac Foundation. Dr. Phillip led an extraordinary study, and I trust he will talk a little bit about it at my alma mater, Georgetown University, that I think shed light on just how serious the Chinese are about threatening this country and others as well. Dr. Carver, over to you. Dr. Carver? You're not Dr. Carver? Dr. Carver is not here. So we're going to turn to Mark Schneider, who is going to tell us about what Dr. Carver would tell us about if he were here, and he will be addressing it in the context of the strategic and other nuclear forces buildup of communist China. Mark, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking today about Chinese nuclear capability. That's seriously, no question about it, it's an existential threat to the United States, and it is increasing. On that, just about everyone agrees. The Chinese practice very extreme secrecy, concealment, and deception activities. You can read about this in various Pentagon reports, but overall, very few people really take that into consideration. What we do know about China, and literally most of what I'm going to be saying today is right out of the Pentagon reports. You can, generally speaking, actually find the same thing in the Asian press about 5 years before it appeared in the Defense Department report. But the DoD report has an important function of basically confirming things that really we've already know on China capability. China is attempting to conceal its actual strength from the United States. It does so on a routine basis in many ways. Anyone who tells you that they know exactly how many nuclear warheads China has is either an idiot or a liar. And you will see this many, many times, a precise number and in any number of reports that appear. That's just silly stuff. We have a range of estimates for current capabilities, from a few hundred nuclear weapons to a few thousand. My personal view is the low estimates are probably low by a factor of several fold. China is clearly not only expanding its capabilities, but is doing so in a way that is very reminiscent of Putin's Russia. You have multiple new systems in every category, ICBMs, SLBMs, bombers, and cruise missiles that are either nuclear armed, in other words, nuclear only, or nuclear capable. The Chinese are building, and Phil Carver put out really the best series of reports and briefings that are available on the internet. Largely a team composed of graduate students in his class was able to put together an amazing amount of information on this. Previous to that report, in the Washington Post wrote it up. You had maybe one passing reference to that in the Pentagon's report, no indication of why the tunnels were important. Well, they are important because they suggest an attempt to do a massive nuclear buildup. There is no reason to build 5,000 kilometers of missile tunnels or 500 kilometers or even 50 kilometers if you're going to just protect a small nuclear force of mobile ICBMs. In my mind, that suggests a very massive intent to deploy capabilities. We have about 5 Chinese ICBM programs underway. Some of them are already operational, the DF-31, the DF-31A, and according to Chinese state media, the DF-41. There are others that are in testing. That includes the DF-31AG that's been paraded through the capital of China at the last military parade. It's certainly a real program, and it's reportedly MIRVed. They have 2 SLBM programs, the Type 094 submarine with JL-2, a single warhead missile, and they have a program called the Type 096 submarine, which reportedly will carry the JL-3, which is MIRVed. So they are in the process of a major expansion in their strategic nuclear capability, and I think that's beyond any doubt at all. We have the same sort of thing going on in the theater capability. It's even more extensive than the strategic nuclear. According to a 2017 Air Force intelligence report, a classified report that is available on the internet, there was literally 33 short and medium-range Chinese ballistic missiles. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. And now you have, after a very extensive test program involving hypersonic vehicles, they're at the verge of actually deploying these systems, and that's a very serious threat to our theater missile defense capabilities. So we have a situation where all of these sorts of things is going on in the context of the largest sustained military buildup in the post-war world, both in terms of the annual increase in military spending and in the scope of what is going on. The Chinese no first use declaration, I think, is just bogus. Colonel Larry Wurtzel did a great analysis of this, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago. And he pointed out something that should have been obvious to everybody. And until I read this, I didn't really catch it. It's impossible to violate the Chinese no first use commitment, irrespective of what you actually do. If you introduce nuclear weapons first under the no first use statement, you haven't violated it. So we have a situation where we're getting a major program underway, and that program is extremely dangerous, and we really have to do something about it. Thank you.
So just to emphasize that one point, a 3,000-mile complex of hardened underground tunnels. We talk about infrastructure in this country. That's an infrastructure investment, and it is being used for the purposes Marcus talked about that will increasingly threaten this country and others as well. A man who has spent most of his professional life trying to protect our country is our next speaker. He is one of our most decorated military veterans, specifically in the special forces, but he has spent a very considerable amount of his time working on intelligence matters, including for a period at the Central Intelligence Agency. He finished up his government service as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and he is these days the Executive Vice President of the Family Research Council, a great friend and valued colleague, General Boykin.
Thanks, Frank. When I went over to the CIA in 1995, the chief of station from Beijing had just returned, and I sat down with him and got a briefing on what was going on, and there was a big concern about the cyber capabilities of China, and increasing cyber capabilities. So my first question was, well, where did they get this sophisticated technology? And the answer was they either stole it from us or they reverse engineered it. They are still doing both. In fact, they're very sophisticated today. But then in 2003, when I came back to the Department of Defense and became the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, they sat down to give me a China briefing, and I was absolutely blown away with what had happened between 1995 and 2003 with regards to China in 8 short years. And I said, how could this be? And they said to me, I said, China owns our debt. How could they possibly want to do these things that you're telling me they want to do? And they said, you need to get the treatise, Unrestricted Warfare, which was mentioned earlier, and you need to read it, and you will understand that there is not necessarily an agreement between the Chinese military leadership and the Chinese civilian leadership. And in fact, these two colonels that wrote Unrestricted Warfare in 1998 laid out the absolute roadmap for how they intended to take over America, and they are in the process of doing everything that they said they wanted to do in that treatise that came out in 1999. We were focused in 2003 on their power projection capabilities because they were no longer just a constabulary force or a force to defend the homeland. They could project power globally, not just in the Pacific Rim. We were concerned about their satellites, their anti-satellites, their lasers, as I said, their cyber capabilities, and especially about their naval capabilities. And look at the aircraft carrier that they have today. Although I'm told by my naval aviators that it's going to take them a long time to figure out how to actually use that aircraft carrier, but I just wanted to put a marker down. They have a sophisticated one. And then they gave me a counterintelligence brief, and that is where I was really blown away when they said every university in America is penetrated. They have not only Chinese students, but Chinese exchange faculty that are there for one purpose, and that is to gain as much intelligence about America and about what we're doing, particularly about our technology, as possible. They had every high-tech company in this country is penetrated by intelligence agents, and even the intel community itself has been penetrated in embassies around the world as well as right here at home. And then let me say this as I come to the close, because Frank's timing me. And I didn't know I was speaking today. They are very sophisticated. And that is one of the things I think the average American fails to understand is the level of sophisticated. First of all, they're brilliant engineers, but they're very sophisticated in how they do their intelligence. And they are also, unlike America, they are unconstrained in collecting intelligence against us. We have restrictions on our intelligence people that are actually hinder their ability to be able to do things. Chinese do not. That in itself is a major issue. And I enjoy Chinese food very much. It's probably my favorite, but what I want is a choice. I don't want to be forced to have to eat it by virtue of the fact that we've given away America.
Thank you. We're going to drill down on several of the topics that General Boykin has just shared with us. And I wanted to introduce to you, those of you in the room have got in your packets a statement by Kevin Freeman, who couldn't be with us today. He's one of the members of the Committee on the Present Danger China who brings to bear a very considerable expertise on economic warfare. And I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from his statement. To understand 21st century China, one must understand Xi Jinping's China dream as the goal, and unrestricted warfare is the primary strategy. Unrestricted Warfare is the translated title of a 1999 book written by two senior military colonels, published by the People's Liberation Army Press. The book predicted the path of China over the past 2 decades with astonishing accuracy. Consider this quote from the English translation. When people begin to lean toward and rejoice in the reduced use of military force to resolve conflicts, war will be reborn in another form and in another arena, becoming an instrument of enormous power in the hands of those who harbor intentions of controlling other countries or regions. He went on to say, if we had taken to heart the message of unrestricted warfare in 1999, we would have been quick to recognize the wide-ranging economic warfare underway, including but not limited to intellectual property theft, hacking, currency manipulation, strategic control of rare earth minerals, satellite warfare, strategic acquisitions, unfair trade practices, financial market manipulations, and a host of other challenges in place today. At the time, however, our national elite's focus was on opening Chinese markets for American business and rushing China into most favored nation status and the World Trade Organization. The political class, for the most part, even seemed willing to overlook clear Chinese efforts to influence our elections. Does that sound familiar? With massive illegal contributions. There was greater public evidence of Chinese interference in the 1996 election than anything demonstrated with regard to Russia in 2016. It is important to note that the Chinese authors were quite open about how they would exploit the economic weapons of unrestricted warfare while Americans remained in ignorance. Quote, the Americans have not been able to get their act together in this area. This is because proposing a new concept of weapons does not require relying on the springboard of new technology. It just demands lucid and incisive thinking. However, this is not a strong point of the Americans, who are slaves to technology and their thinking. The Americans invariably halt their thinking at the boundary where technology has not yet reached. The authors he went on, the authors indicated that Americans see war as solely kinetic, with the intention of direct physical destruction. Further, they suggested that the military of the United States would remain almost exclusively focused on personnel and equipment, on traditional weapons such as ships, planes, tanks, and missiles. Unrestricted warfare looked beyond the military and includes causing riots, stock market crashes, or acquiring a strategic port through purchase as, quote, new concept weapons, unquote. They predicted correctly that Americans wouldn't recognize such activity as warfare, even while it was occurring before their eyes. He went on, we are now entering a critical phase in our relationship with China. The Chinese view themselves as ascendant and expect the demise of American power. In fact, they are actively pursuing that outcome through unrestricted warfare. All investments, whether in Europe, Asia, Africa, or Latin America, must be understood through this lens. All investments in the United States should be reviewed carefully by a strengthened Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Those firms with ties to the People's Liberation Army should be carefully scrutinized, and American investments in China should likewise be available for review. Peter Schweitzer's sobering book, Secret Empires, must be taken to heart. Foreign interests too often use sweetheart deals with American business people and relatives of leadership in order to gain undue influence. He concluded, the essential first step to address these threats is to recognize the fact that what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. We must recognize that a global economic war is already underway with dramatic consequences. We must prepare cogent responses that take into account both national security and economic implications. The Committee on the Present Danger of China is an essential effort in this regard. To talk a bit further about the military piece of what the Chinese are up to, I'm very pleased to say we have with us one of the country's most highly regarded and most accurate, I think, analysts of the Chinese multi-domain, multi-dimensional, and quite aggressive military buildup, Richard Fisher of the International Assessment and Strategy Center, where he is a senior fellow. Welcome, Richard.
Well, Frank, it is very humbling to have been asked to join this latest edition, necessary edition of the Committee on the Present Danger. Early in my career, I had the privilege of working with some veterans of the 1970s edition of the committee and understand very well the important role they played in mobilizing attention and then the policy direction that resulted in President Ronald Reagan's eventual victory over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of China today poses an even greater threat. And I simply want to make 3 basic points. Following on the principle listed in the principles of this current edition of the committee, we state clearly that the Communist Party of China poses an existential threat to the United States and to freedom everywhere. How does the Communist Party seek to do this? Well, they are well along in the process of organizing the world to exclude the United States and to diminish freedom. After having gained such commercial and economic power in all regions of our planet, China is translating economic influence into political influence, and now political influence is being turned into military access. China, the Communist Party, is in the process of organizing several proto-alliances with the explicit goal of excluding the United States and then diminishing freedom. We can tick them off. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is the oldest. Just this past summer, the China-Africa Security and Defense Forum follows very much in the path of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All African countries are members of that forum. It will help to expand the number of military bases that the People's Liberation Army has in Africa. That template is now also being applied to Latin America as China seeks to organize this hemisphere militarily against the United States. As it does so, China is building quickly the means to project power globally and then to control the Earth-Moon system. By the end of the next decade, China may have multiple fully nuclear-powered carrier battle groups, carrier, cruiser, supply ship, all nuclear-powered. China is now building amphibious projection forces, airborne projection forces. These will be quite sizable by the end of the next decade. And then finally, China is also working very hard to project its power into space. The space program is completely controlled by the People's Liberation Army. When a Chinese astronaut finally reaches the moon, perhaps by 2025 or earlier, it will not be a great leap for the history of Chinese civilization. It will be a massive leap for the power of the People's Liberation Army. And the PLA will use its presence on the moon as it is using its presence in low Earth orbit to win battles on the Earth, to advance its goals of global hegemony. Thank you.
Next, another battle space in which the Chinese are waging the war against the sorts of freedoms and values that we hold dear is in its persecution of various minorities for following their faith traditions. A man who has been a leader in protecting religious liberty, the co-chairman of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, is with us, and we've asked him both to speak in his own right and also to convey some of the thoughts of one of our colleagues who, again, could not be here with us, Pastor Bob Fu, the president of China Aid and a former Chinese dissident. Please welcome Greg Mitchell.
Thank you, Frank. It's an honor to be here, everybody. Like Frank said, I chair the International Religious Freedom Roundtable here in Washington. It's a safe space where we bring all the different faith groups together, and it's a place where we can all discuss problems that are restricting religious freedom, and then figure out how we can all work together to resolve them and handle them. And one of the top problems we've been focused on is religious persecution in China. It's so bad, it really is an effort to eradicate religion. Ambassador Sam Brownback, who we work with on a regular basis and coordinate with as much as possible. So it seems like the Chinese government is at war with faith, and that's exactly how we see it, and that's exactly how we're addressing it and working against it. So what we've done is we've formed a coalition to advance religious freedom in China. It's the first time we've done this. The Roundtable's been around for 9 years. It's the first time we've ever, out of the Roundtable, formed a coalition to focus on one country. It's so bad in China. And the purpose is to bring all the persecuted communities of China together and bring them together, get them talking with one voice, get them working as one unified group to fight back against the persecution. Because people are not only being persecuted, but they're being detained, they're being tortured, they're being killed for their faith. We held our first press conference on March 4th. We had all the different faith communities together. We had China Aid with Bob Fu, who I'm going to read from his statement, Citizen Power Initiatives for China, Church of Almighty God, Falun Gong, Early Rain, Covenant Church, multiple Weger groups, Tibetan Buddhists, all there working as one group. And the optic is they were all standing on stage as one group, and also we're bringing up multiple faith communities together with them, standing with them in solidarity. But anyway, let me read from Bob Fu's statement. He's one of the co-chairs of the coalition, a very active participant of the Roundtable. He says, on February 1, 2018, the CCP's new regulation on religious affairs took effect. At least 10,000 churches were shut down the same day. Thousands of crosses were burnt or forcibly destroyed. A few months later, with CCP's direct assistance in the Kachin minority area in Burma, the exact same thing happened. Churches were ordered to remove crosses or shut down. All Christian humanitarian workers from China were either arrested or handed over to CCP security officers for detention or simply deported. Friends, this is only a tiny example of the CCP's threat to the world. A few more points from Bob here. In 1997, he said, my family were accepted as refugees by the United States due to severe religious persecution. At the time, the most hotly debated topic in Washington was whether America should permanently de-link the relationship between trade and human rights. In May 2000, Congress passed legislation to grant permanent normal trade relations with China. The State Department at the time reassured the American people that granting China this normal trade relations status and entry into the World Trade Organization would cost us nothing. We claimed that the positive change in China toward more reform would be inevitable. But Bob says it should be regarded as one of the worst decisions ever taken by a U.S. administration and Congress. It might have opened some trade doors, but with 1.4 billion Chinese without internet access, 1.5 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in concentration camps in Xinjiang, increasing persecution against tens of millions of believers. This is how bad it is. It's a catastrophe the United States can no longer ignore, and it's time for the international community to recognize this reality. And we're doing our part at the IRF Roundtable and with the new Coalition to Advance Religious Freedom in China. And we're going to be coordinating as much as possible with Ambassador Sam Brownback and his team at the State Department. And we're here to work with you all too. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Another piece of this picture is what is happening in other parts of the world. I mentioned in my opening remarks that the third world is being targeted by the Chinese. And I have a brief statement from a man who is a hugely successful business leader on the continent of Africa, who I'm very pleased to say is part of the Committee on the Present Danger China Coalition. His name is Benedict Peters. He is a pioneer really in the oil and gas industry in his native Nigeria, but he's been widely recognized as a business leader and entrepreneur, and he runs a company called Iteo Group. He talks about the fact that, quote, Africa is under threat from a new era of colonialism, from the totalitarian government of the People's Republic of China. I'm proud to be a founding member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China to combat the expansion of the communist regime that threatens Africa's nations and the free world. Chinese leaders have ushered a new era of colonialism under the guise of foreign investment and economic development. African nations are victims of an exploitative infrastructure program known as the Belt and Road Initiative that exploits our resources and bankrupts our people. Under the veil of economic development, the Belt and Road Initiative is saddling African nations with debt, corruption, and failing infrastructure. In return, China is granted preferential treatment in matters of diplomacy and security that furthers China's ambitions for global hegemony. I'm excited to partner with U.S. leaders who share my urgency to combat the expansion of China. I have seen firsthand what the rise of China is doing to developing nations, and I fear time is running out for world leaders to respond. It is my hope that the Committee on the Present Danger of China will spur U.S. leaders into action and unite the free world against China. The China threat will not subside without unified opposition led by the United States. Personally, I couldn't agree more, and I'm very appreciative of Mr. Peters' leadership and involvement with us. A man who's been tracking what the Chinese are doing in another part of the world is our next speaker. His name is Jose Cardenas. He served in senior positions at the National Security Council, Defense Department, most recently as an assistant administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development with responsibility for Latin America. We're very pleased to have him with us. Jose, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. And wow, I was really struck by that statement by Mr. Peters, because it basically word for word could be applied to Latin America as well, Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, some of the words you've heard today have been magnitude and scope. And it is very important to understand that not only is the United States a target of the People's Republic of China, but other areas of the world, Africa and Latin America included. And those activities all have the single result of undermining what is the core, one of the core objectives of United States foreign and national security policy, and that is, of course, promoting a stable global order. To me, there's no better example of the kind of destructive behavior of China in these regions, and in particularly in Latin America, than to look at what is happening in Venezuela today. You cannot, obviously, I don't have to get into the sordid details. Obviously, if you flip on cable news or open up a newspaper, you see what is happening in Venezuela. Here is a country that sits on top of probably the biggest amount of proven oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia, and they literally cannot keep the lights on. What does China have to do with the situation in Venezuela? Well, China has been the banker, not only the banker of first resort, the banker of last resort. China has lent the Chavez Maduro regime in Venezuela up to $100 billion, billion with a B. And we don't know what the precise number is because there is no transparency. We do not know how much money that China has put into Venezuela. And why? The second question is, why should we care? What is it to the United States? Well, first of all, we care when our neighbors are going through such a difficult humanitarian situation. But it also impacts U.S. interests, what's happening in Venezuela, because it's sparking a migration crisis. To date, about 10% of the Venezuelan population has fled. And estimates are that if the current situation continues in Venezuela, another 5 million Venezuelans will flee in the next 12 months. They've already overwhelming the support services in Colombia, a country where the United States has deep strategic interests. The second reason we should care is because what's happening in the instability in Venezuela is providing free rein for transnational organized crime. And that is primarily invested in trafficking drugs to the United States. So it is vitally important what is happening in Venezuela. And China is working day and night to sustain that regime. It will not lend its efforts towards a peaceful transition in that country. Just off the news, off the headlines as well, the Inter-American Development Bank just had to cancel a planned meeting in China because China refused to allow the interim president, recognized by 50 countries, to attend the meeting. So the United States and our Latin American allies pulled out. China is working against the democratic opposition in Venezuela by lending its services to disrupt social media in Venezuela. And again, as we, in relation to Mr. Peters' argument, looking across the whole region, the predatory lending, the corrupt business practices, the bribing, is setting back sustainable democratic development in our neighborhood by decades for the sole purpose of, again, achieving its global ambitions. We need to be paying attention. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Very quickly, another statement that will set up the next of our speakers. This is from Captain Jim Fennell, a man who has known, I think, in the community as a leader on the kinds of military and non-military developments that are causing China to be such a threat. We asked him to specifically focus on an area in which he's quite expert, having been the director of intelligence and information operations at the U.S. Pacific Fleet in his last duty station in the United States Navy. He is a retired captain, and the statement reads as follows, quote, China's unilateral expansion into and through the international waters within the first island chain, or what Beijing now calls China's blue territories, over the past 6 years has altered the strategic balance of power dramatically in the Indo-Pacific region. That strategic balance has shifted in favor of the People's Republic of China and against America's security and interests. In addition to building a modern blue water navy, the PRC has taken a wide range of destabilizing actions that pose an increasing threat to global security. Among these actions are the construction of naval air stations in the South China Sea, including on Mischief Reef, which is located within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, a U.S. ally. Its declaration of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea near Japan. Its claims of sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, and its flat-out repudiation of the authority of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the world's oldest standing international law arbitral body. The threatening actions also include China's unprecedented and increasing naval operations in the Western Pacific, South Pacific, and Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean and the Baltic Seas, the Arctic and Antarctic, and finally, the Atlantic Ocean. These actions are clear empirical indicators of China's future malign intentions and capabilities. Such intentions and capabilities position China's military forces, particularly its Navy, Air Forces, missile forces, and rapidly expanding Marine Corps, to become the arbiters of a new global order, one that stands opposed to U.S. national interest and values and those of our friends and allies. China has spent billions of dollars on a military that can achieve the dreams of the Chinese Communist Party. It is crucial to establish firmly and quickly why the PRC's rapid, global, and very expensive military expansion matters. The CCP is engaged in a total, protracted struggle for regional and global supremacy. This supremacy is at the heart of Xi Jinping's China dream. China's arsenal in this campaign for supremacy includes economic, informational, political, and military warfare. The campaign at its heart is opportunistic. We have witnessed already China's expansion into the vacuum of a diminishing U.S. presence in East Asia. America needs to regain its military deterrence position in the Indo-Pacific, supported by strong allies, something that has been sorely neglected since the fall of the Soviet Union. Without accomplishing such a correlation of forces, expect China to push us even farther from Asia. Expect to lose more allies and influence across the Indo-Pacific, and ultimately expect to be seen as globally irrelevant, with all the negative consequences for our national security interests and the defense of our values. We've already slipped. If we fall any further, we may not recover. Unquote. A case in point is Taiwan. And to tell us a little bit about what China has in mind for Taiwan and what it is doing to translate what it has in mind into real threats, I'm pleased to say we have Mark Stokes with us. He is the executive director of a tremendously important organization, the Project 2049 Institute. Mark?
Thank you, Frank, and appreciate the invitation to come in and speak briefly about one of my favorite topics, and that's Taiwan and U.S. policy, U.S. cross-strait policy. There's so many aspects of the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to Taiwan. You addressed, or Captain Fentanyl addressed, I think in good measure, the military challenges that the Chinese Communist Party and its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army, poses to Taiwan, and not just Taiwan, but by extension also to the United States. There's significant economic challenges faced by people on Taiwan, being posed by the Chinese Communist Party and across the Taiwan Strait. But there's another aspect, and that's the political challenges that people on Taiwan and the United States face. With the inauguration of President Tsai Ing-wen in May of 2016, Taiwan completed its third successful change of government in its history, as well as the first successful change in control in the legislative yuan. The Chinese Communist Party, however, has long sought the political subordination of people on Taiwan under its formula for unification, and that's something known as one country, two systems. Under this so-called one China principle, there's one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international community. From Beijing's perspective, the Republic of China, that is the formal constitutionally founded title of Taiwan, ceased to exist in 1949. The PRC, in its view, focuses as the successor state and the sole legal government of a China that includes Taiwan. Now, viewing political legitimacy as a zero-sum game in applying its one China principle internationally. So this zero-sum game is something that's played internationally, including here in Washington, D.C. The Chinese Communist Party seeks the further political isolation of Taiwan and co-management of U.S.-Taiwan relations as a means to counter the democratically elected leadership on terms favorable to Beijing. In general, what I often do is sort of give, for context, make some things to consider and why we need to think long and hard about our cross-strait policy, primarily for three reasons. Number one, objective reality. The objective reality is that Taiwan, under its current Republic of China Constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. This is objective reality. It's important to understand the difference between this objective reality and policy. And there is something different. Just because we shifted diplomatic recognition from one side to the other in 1979 doesn't negate the legitimacy and the existence of the ROC. But imagine, looking at this from a perspective, imagine our U.S. one-China policy as being somewhat of a zero-sum game, and that's the way it's often conceived. You only have normal relations with one side of the Taiwan Strait or the other. And before 1979, we had formal diplomatic relations with the ROC. After 1979, with the PRC. This zero-sum game, it's odd because since 1979, in effect, if you look at this zero-sum as being somewhat of legitimacy, Beijing certainly views it as a zero-sum game. We extend legitimacy in the form of official diplomatic relations with an autocratic regime, the Chinese Communist Party, and we withhold at least equal legitimacy from a country that has evolved into a vibrant democracy. And every single day, and this particular zero-sum game is played out every day in our policy. I could go on, but I think I will leave it here, and back to you.
The trouble, of course, is that the Chinese are very busily pursuing the means by which to execute that zero-sum strategy to the extreme, well, probably destruction of Taiwan. A man who has served in that theater and done so there and elsewhere with great distinction in the uniform of the United States Air Force is our next presenter. Lieutenant General Tom McInerney rose through the ranks to become the Assistant Chief of the United States Air Force. He has been a business leader. He's been a prolific commentator on Fox News and elsewhere about the national security issues of our time, an author, and I think his voice really needs to be heard, most especially on the topic we've asked him to address today, which is another threat vector from China. You've heard others touch on it, but Tom McInerney is going to talk a little bit about the theft of our technology. General, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank, and thanks for your leadership on the Leadership Committee on Present Danger. It is extremely important. China is taking the gloves off its theft of U.S. technology secrets. There's no doubt about that. Beijing, over the last 2 years, has significantly ramped up its economic espionage in hacking, and it is taking place after a marked increase in such activity during the last 2 years. It cuts across commercial technology and intellectual property, from jet engines to genetically modified rice. As relations between China and the Trump administration have grown more acrimonious under President Trump's bold leadership, who has finally said, we will no longer accept this theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property. Finally. They want technology by hook or crook, and they want it now. They have taken the gloves off, and they don't care if they get caught or if people go to jail. As long as the ends justify the means, they are not going to stop. Beware, America. There was a brief lull in this espionage after Obama brought it up to President Xi during the last 2 years of the Obama administration. That trend reversed itself, and now President Trump has threatened steep sanctions, so we will see what happens during these negotiations. Currently, the Chinese military no longer directs the bulk of this hacking, but the Chinese Civilian Intelligence Agency, the Ministry of Security, has taken the lead. This trend is troubling because the spy service has more seasoned hackers and they are more difficult to catch or track. Bottom line, their tradecraft is much better. Again, beware, America. The Chinese theft from Micron is a prime example how we lost Micron's dynamic random access memory, DRAM chip, technology to the Chinese. They hired several Micron engineers who literally brought thousands of trade secrets valued between $4 and $8.75 billion. The damage has been done. Now in an area much closer to my core business is the copycat Air Force that the Chinese have built using cyber warfare, just like our F-22 and F-35s, as well as the Russian Su-27s. It used to take 10 years for our adversaries to catch up with us. Now they do it in 2 to 4 years. So the technological advantage we used to have has been dramatically eroded. The J-20 is a cookie cutter of our F-22, and the J-31 is a cookie cutter of the F-35, all gained through cyber warfare. The initiatives taken by this administration are extremely important, but unfortunately, we have U.S. companies like Apple and Google who are working closely and voluntarily with the Chinese, especially in artificial intelligence. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff met with Google last week to discuss this subject, according to press reports. However, we haven't gotten any feedback on that. In conclusion, we have a serious challenge with the theft of our technology and IP that will determine the balance of power for us in the future. Too many administrations were being good guys and thinking that the Chinese, by increasing their wealth, they would be more democratic. Wrong. Beware, America. We must protect our vital interests in technology and stop this theft. Thank you very much.
I'm pleased to say we have a representative of one of the great leaders on Capitol Hill involved in both recognizing and trying to counter what the Chinese are doing, particularly in the arena of their abuses of human rights. I'm personally of the view that a country that treats its own people terribly is unlikely to treat ours very well. I'm pleased to introduce Piero Tosi. He is a staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee working with one of its leaders, now ranking member, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, to talk a little bit about what the Congressman's focus is and ways in which the Committee on the Present Danger of China can be of help to him. Piero.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you really for convening this and being such a galvanizing figure. It's really important, I think, what you're doing and what all of you out here are doing. I just very briefly, and unfortunately, Congressman Smith had a prior commitment, could not be here with you, but he asked me to come and talk about 3 pieces of legislation that he has introduced already in this new Congress. The first is the Uyghur Human Rights Act. The second is a bill on fentanyl and China's role in exporting fentanyl to the United States. And the third piece of legislation is Chinese Influence Act, which talks about China's penetration of institutions here in the United States. Following on Bob Fu's remarks, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, we have over 1 million people that are kept in concentration camps. One of the most egregious human rights violations is occurring right now in China. It is also something that, just following up on remarks that we just heard, marries big technology with that. China is using artificial intelligence tracking to track down Uyghur dissidents, and we really, for the purpose of the intrinsic value of human dignity here, it is important that we do take a stand for on behalf of the Uyghurs and other oppressed minorities in China. But beyond that, though, the importance of human rights and human rights legislation, people sometimes think only in terms of hard legislation, military power, but it's also very important that we do emphasize human rights. When we do meet with other countries, especially OIC countries, many of them particularly in Africa, have been very silent, Organization of Islamic Countries, with regards to China's treatment of the Muslim Uyghur population. This is a terrible abdication, I think, of moral responsibility, and oftentimes it's done because of their involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative or because of the debt pressure that China puts on these countries. So it is very important when we highlight in our meetings that what China is doing to a Muslim minority within China. And it also, I think, helps our geostrategic objectives of countering China. The second bill, the Fentanyl Bill, China, I think, imprinted in Chinese memory is that of the Opium War and the indignities that they suffered and what drugs did to China. Well, in some ways, they've now had a chance to reverse that. And we see China as a major producer of fentanyl, which is this highly addictive artificial opioid, which kills people. It's a killer substance. A little tiny dose of fentanyl is enough to kill. That's one of the reasons why we have so many drug overdoses here. China has this idea of asymmetric warfare, not direct confrontation, but using drugs such as fentanyl. They are a producer, of fentanyl and also precursor chemicals that are then processed in places like Mexico and smuggled into the border. So Mr. Smith has introduced legislation that would identify those that are involved in the production of fentanyl and to sanction them. Finally, the Chinese Influence Act. Mr. Smith has held 2 hearings on the Confucius Institutes here that we have in China. He had a GAO report done on the Confucius Institutes. That's just one example of how China pushes its ideas on university campuses here. One of the things that the Chinese Influence Bill would do is require FARA registration, Foreign Agent Registration Act registration of Confucius Institutes and others that seek to push China's influence here. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Gaffney, for the work that you do. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, again, we're going to drill down on this a little bit further. I did want to read a statement by one of our other colleagues who could not be with us. Robert Charles formerly served as an Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. He wanted to be heard on this matter of fentanyl. He said, quote, "China's involvement in dealing deadly drugs to America is profound, pernicious, and incontrovertible, but it is not intractable. The facts are arresting, even without comment. In 2017, more than 28,000 young Americans died of overdoses inflicted by Chinese imports of the synthetic drug fentanyl. China knows that fact, and so does the White House. The prime source of fentanyl is China, where more than 600 manufacturers turn out this chemical with regularity and apparent impunity. That is why in every instance of negotiation with China on regional and global security, arms control and sanctions, tariffs, transparency, trade rebalancing, there should be an occasion for raising the fentanyl issue. We can lose our country by failing to respond to a military or trade frontal assault. We can also lose our nation to insidious social, chemical, narcotics influences. Fentanyl makes this case persuasively. Make no mistake, a communist country that can control internet traffic and content, bend and steal Western intellectual property, address their corporate culture and trade to their whim, mandate and enforce a one-child policy, round up millions of citizens for re-education based on religious convictions, effectively outlaw Christianity, free dialogue and dissent, certainly can shut down the manufacture and transshipment of fentanyl if it wants to. Indeed, the Chinese surveillance state, with artificial intelligence, widening use of facial recognition, infiltration of private and corporate life, informants, and tabs on every writer who opposes the state, certainly can find and shut down the producers of fentanyl. Missing, however, is the Chinese Communist Party's will to do so. That is why the United States and our allies should raise the issue of Chinese imports of this deadly substance at every turn. We can work to stop it here with enormous effort and at staggering cost, measured in terms of lost lives and squandered national treasure. On the other hand, the Communist Chinese Party could stop it with relative ease at the source, provided it wanted to. Meanwhile, it is we who must step up, shut this poison out, and demand that Beijing's resolve match our own. China is well aware of the human and financial impact of this assault via fentanyl is having on America. We must insist that this sort of Chinese chemical warfare against our youth, culture, laws, public health, and safety come to an immediate end. I wanted also to ask Sasha Gong to come forward. Sasha is a woman who has defied the Chinese government and been punished for it. She has also, since she was able to flee her native China, obtain a PhD from Harvard, no small thing, but also to lead the Mandarin section of the Voice of America for a time. We asked her to talk to us about the kinds of information operations that Chris Smith is trying to address in this legislation. Sasha, to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to overcome my shortcoming by coming here. Well, it happens a lot, I have to say. Actually, thank you for all the generals and all the soldiers who defend our country so greatly. And what I want to say one thing, I want to talk about another kind of war. The war the Chinese Communist Party has been launching against us for a long time, and we are losing ground. This is a war of ideology, an ideological war, and we are losing ground. At this point, we are almost defenseless. I think that's as urgent as military defense. And well, let me talk a few months ago, I read a report from China. It's about the One Belt, One Road. It said One Belt, One Road, we built all this, we did, but one very important task of the One Belt, One Road, this is from the CCP Central Committee, that we have to bring our reporters, bring our programs. We have to launch what they call award programs to nurture local journalists. We have to bring our broadcasting programs in their local language. We have to go there. In other words, the Chinese said, we have to go there to capture their hearts and minds. Losing hearts and minds is what we have been losing for a while. And the Chinese went to each country they went to, they make sure in Pakistan, they broadcast in Urdu, in Africa, they broadcast in different languages. And in the United States, what they do is that they set up the CCTV division here. Actually, once I sent a reporter to cover the place and to see what are they doing. They have 2 cable channels here. And the place of CCTV there in Washington, New York Avenue, is twice as big as Voice of America. And they employed a lot more people. Their people are much, much better paid. Not mentioning their equipments are so much better. And I was looking at the tape when they came back. I said, Jesus, we are in the primitive age. We are, in terms of broadcasting. And so in this case, we actually, if you go to New York Avenue, look at CCTV, we know there's enemy at the gate. And what we are doing? We are sleeping in many ways. And well, I saw Chinese diaspora media here. What happens, the Chinese were very smart in one way, in a way of being aggressive. They capture the diaspora's media around the world. They work on with, if you guys are interested, not long ago, Hoover Institution issued a report on that, and you can look at it, and I think this guy's maybe a few leftovers of the Chinese could not buy, the Chinese media. And in our way, our responses to the Chinese aggressions very inadequate. In terms of Voice of America, for example, I know, I have been working there for a while. What they do, they take the CNN model, say, hey, 50% we are for the Chinese, 50% we are against the Chinese. We are disarming ourselves. Meanwhile, the Chinese are taking our ground. and broadcasting here and taking our people and winning hearts and minds in the world. So, in a way, when I look at all this anti-American, media criticizing our president, I was thinking of what Reagan said: no nation will survive with such self-disdain and such self-denial. Look at our media doing that. And at this point, I also want to quote President Reagan once said, there is a point beyond which they must not advance. We are at that point. Thank you.
Sasha, thank you. We're also at the point where we're supposed to wrap up, so we'll try to do this very quickly. I do want, though, to call on my colleague Mike Waller, who has been very actively involved in political warfare strategies, their study, their analysis, their practice in a variety of academic institutions, and is currently the Vice President for Government Relations at the Center for Security Policy, just to sort of tie in how influence operations by the Chinese are sort of the twin sister, if you will, of what Sasha was just talking about on the information operation side. Mike?
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, Chinese influence operations is more of an inherent strategy that they have, where pretty much everything they do is in one way or another an influence operation. And many of those influence operations are designed to have psychological effects on us, each of us. Our whole decision-making leadership, the people behind that decision-making leadership, all the way down to our children. If you look at some of the children's movies now that are produced, you see some very strong China regime support elements in certain children's cartoons and popular movies. So you see it throughout our culture and throughout every aspect of society. So let's just to go down through a few of them. They want to influence, like any influencer does, how we perceive them, how we perceive their regime, and how we perceive ourselves. In this case, their regime is permanent, advancing, invincible. We are not. Therefore, we should kowtow to what they want and need. How we understand ourselves. So perception, understanding, how we understand them, which is why they have certain types of censorship and why certain publications are not available in certain languages, even in some of our own publishing houses. And then how we act. So this is our own personal actions, policy actions, how we develop our strategies and so forth, what we say and what we do not say, and what we do and do not do is all of very great importance to the People's Republic of China leadership. Now, Rick Fisher touched on this on a global military influence, so I won't get into that. So it's not just happening to us, but it's happening globally, worldwide, and it's affecting our traditional alliances as well as ourselves here at home. But you look at the money side of it, everything sort of goes on money, but American business, other Western business, banking, trade, construction, manufacturing, technology, you name it, those are all positions for the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party to exert influence on our CEOs, on our privately held corporations, on corporations seeking either to do business inside the PRC or seeking Chinese investment in their own business models. That is all something where there is a political price to pay or a policy price to pay for advancing that business. Or a silence for advancing that business. And then you have media. We'll go for the news media. It's pretty obvious. We have the Washington Post as one of the main, its printing presses are one of the main printing presses of Chinese communist propaganda in the United States, because the Chinese pay the Washington Post to print certain of their publications here. You have denial, censorship, disinformation, propaganda, but you also have, more importantly, arguably, is social media, which reaches everybody, every man, woman, and child practically in the country. It's search engines, Google. It's the byproducts of those search engines and social media like Facebook. All the visual stuff, all the usual stuff, plus direct intrusions into our own personal lives. So they can now go into our own family information, our own private information, our likes and dislikes, into our medical records, into our DNA records, into our and when you marry this in with artificial intelligence and the facial recognition technology and all these other emerging technologies, you're going to see a control system that the PRC is going to be able to use remotely to affect every single one of us for this generation and beyond. Oh, wait. I will say, though, there's a bright side to this, which is that they want us to think they're invincible, but they're really not, and there's a lot of neat things we can do to stick it back to them.
More on that in the next moment or two. I do want to just recognize one other individual before we come to our closing speaker. Jim Woolsey alluded to Peter Vincent Pry's expertise on matters involving electromagnetic pulse, among many other things. But arguably one of the most frightening angles of attack of the Chinese over the decades against us and against, the world more generally has been its proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Peter Pry is an expert on that, having studied these matters at the Central Intelligence Agency and as a staff member on Capitol Hill in a number of capacities, also as the executive director of the incredibly important Congressional Commission on the Electromagnetic Pulse Threat. Peter Pry.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for bringing back the Committee on the Present Danger, China, which does indeed pose an existential threat to the United States. I'd like to take before going into some of the proliferation issues, and since we've got such little time, to just reinforce from a 30,000-foot perspective some of what was said. There's a lot of references have been made today, for example, to the book Unrestricted Warfare, all right? One of the most two important lessons to take from that sort of haven't been mentioned, but I think it's been alluded to by previous speakers, is that first, China as a totalitarian state sees us as constantly at war. The idea of peace is a Western construct. Peace is not reflected in unrestricted warfare or in their other doctrinal writings. There are only the defeated and the victor or the dead. And that's basically where we are with them. The idea that we are right now at peace is our point of view. That's not their point of view. They are at war. They're at war with us. And the war is very real. We've talked a lot about economic warfare, and a lot of Americans think, well, economic warfare, that doesn't affect me, that just affects Wall Street, right? Every American city has got a manufacturing sector that today looks like a German city in the aftermath of World War II. It's been bombed out. Every American city is filled with people in despair, working class people that don't have jobs anymore. The suicide rate's never been higher, okay? There's despair in the country among these people. Crime rate is terrible. So the casualties are real enough. And if someone were to do a study on it, I'll bet more Americans have died in this war already than in Vietnam or since World War II. Now to go to the more technical, boring aspect of what I'm supposed to talk about, there's another book that hasn't been mentioned today by Shen-Wei Guan called Third World War, Total Information Warfare, which should be right on that shelf with Unrestricted Warfare. And this basically describes what Jim Woolsey had alluded to before about combining cyber warfare with nuclear EMP attack. It's a new way of warfare, okay, that would enable them to avoid the shooting war. The idea is to use a combination of cyber and EMP attack. Yes, a nuclear EMP attack is a cyber attack in their doctrine. To cause a blackout of North America, 99% of our military bases rely on the electric power grid for their electricity. It could shut down the whole country permanently by taking out the electric power grid, water, communications, everything depends directly or indirectly on electricity. And in effect, you could avoid having to actually have a shooting World War III and defeat us by this new way of warfare. And we're not prepared for it. We're not prepared for it. Thank you so much, Frank, for raising the alarm to America.
Peter, thank you. Suffice it to say, proliferation is a problem too, but we've ran out of time. To close us out, and I want to thank everyone for their patience. This has been a long and, I hope, very informative program for you, but we did want to leave with a sense of both purpose and perhaps even a little bit of optimism in the face of all we've heard. Ed Timberlake is a man who has served his country in uniform, the United States Marine Corps. He has been an assistant secretary in the Department of Veterans Affairs. He's worked on Capitol Hill. He has written important books about China now for decades. And we wanted him to talk a little bit about the U.S. response to all of this. The purpose of this committee is not simply to raise the alarm about the danger, but also to see what we can do about it. So Ed Timberlake, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm a Navy junior. My dad was subs, and I think the first song I ever heard was Victory at Sea in the Cradle, which gave me a tremendous sense of optimism. You watch that series about 10 times, and there's nothing the U.S. Navy can't fight, win, and do. Consequently, my uncle was killed on Iwo Jima. The family is very happy. We're in partnership and alliance with Japan, South Korea, down through the Philippines, who are coming online right now as I probably speak. Taiwan is essential, into Australia. Don't make the Vietnamese grumbly in the South China Sea. They have ways and means of teaching China a lesson, reach around to India. So I'm very optimistic that we have allies willing to go the mile, fight, win with us. They have clients who probably don't like them very much when they sell stuff to them, which is a good news. As Director of Mobilization for Ronald Reagan, I always learned technology is relative against a reactive enemy. It's a relative action-reaction cycle. That's an ironclad rule of technology development. Consequently, the goal is to catch us on the upswing of quality and at sufficient quantity. And that's how we fight and win. Are we there yet? No. Do I think that President Trump has the exact same love and heart for the American military that Ronald Reagan has? Absolutely, 100% yes, slam dunk. So consequently, when you get the technology equation moving in the right direction, you have two intangibles you have to deal with. One, the warfighting ethic at the mid-level, the squadron pilots, the combat sergeants, the ship drivers, the sub-drivers, the people who do the silo sitting and stuff like that. I've been out there in the last 8 years visiting all the bases and talking to them. They've got the ethos. They've got the warfighting skills inside them because they argue with each other and they only want the best. We have a saying, ability leads in those places, not rank, which is very, very telling to our way of war. Consequently, that intangible is valuable, but it's only valuable if you have the other dimension to it, which is the training ranges. And if you look throughout the Pacific Rim, you have exercise and ranges the Chinese can only dream about. You come back to America, you got Fallon, you got Nellis, you got Yuma. We can fight and win on those training ranges. Closest thing we can get to combat. That's why that's why Red Flag was invented, to simulate the first 10 missions of a combat engagement. And they kind of got that right. So you have all these things coming together, and I'm very happy. The key there is Nimitz's great quote from World War II, height of the World War II fight. He said, the most important thing you can do to the Navy, big blue blanket that covered the Pacific, is train, train, train. We have warriors willing to do that. We get them the equipment, and they're ready to fight and win. I'm very optimistic on that. Now, one last point on the full spectrum of warfare. We've had a lot of talk about that. Right now, today, I'm very proud of joining this team right here. Beijing, see this right here? What's happening with that team is right now, right here in this room, we are declaring information war as a unity of purpose against the People's Republic of China. And that is a very powerful force to unleash in America today. And that's the killer shot, so that I will be optimistic at the end game that, like Ronald Reagan, we win and you lose. Thank you, Frank.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we have to clear the room. So I owe you an apology to those of you who wanted to ask questions. We will stick around, but we will have to do so. Pardon me? I do want to just say a word about several of the things that are in the handouts and that are going to be available at our website, which is presentdangerchina.org. But I just wanted to say this is meant not to be the last opportunity to interact with the media. To the contrary, as Ed just said, it's intended for us to be very much involved with people who are trying to help the rest of us know what's going on, and most especially know what's going on in the various silos, if you will, or angles of attack that we've described here in some detail. I want to thank all of the wonderful people who are part of this coalition, particularly those who are here today, and there are many more who are signing up, honestly, by the day. And we will be doing more both on articulating the threat and also offering advice as to how it can be fixed. I wanted to just mention, as I was cued to do by my friend Bill Gertz, that in the packets is a statement about the trade deal. And let me just say about the trade deal, we are very much of the view as a committee that if the president can address successfully some of the serious, persistent, and very vexing trade imbalances and activities and practices of the Chinese over the years, that would be wonderful. We hope he will, and we hope he won't settle for what proved to be, as in the past, empty or false promises by the Chinese. But what this program has, I hope, impressed upon all of you is that even if there is a successful trade agreement, even if the Chinese faithfully honor all of the commitments they make in it, we are still facing a world of hurt at their hands. And we must address these other dimensions of the problem, which ultimately emanate from the character of the Chinese regime, namely that it is ruled brutally in a totalitarian fashion by the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a mission statement of the new Committee on the Present Danger China, some of the guiding principles that have brought this team together, and we hope will become a rallying point for many Americans across this country. We appreciate very much your being here and taking aboard this information, and look forward to addressing questions that you may have, either as we break down the room or in the days ahead. Please check out, as a resource as well as a hopefully inspiration, presentdangerchina.org. This is Frank Gaffney. Thank you very much for being here. God bless you all.